especially with tariffs and the modern equivalent of currency wars that we're seeing take place today. Is it going to take a crisis before they act? Because they seem to want to continue the same policies. You're hearing, okay, we'll be okay if we just tax the rich. They need to pay their fair share. But as you pointed out, you could tax the rich, take away their money, you're still going to have a budget deficit, and we're still sending interest overseas. In fact, I read a figure that we're paying China in interest on the debt it owes. We're paying them enough interest to pay for their entire military expenditures.
Sure. I mean, it's incredible that they always want to blame corporations and say, oh, they ship jobs overseas and that's why we're losing jobs. If you look at the amount of interest that we're paying that's leaving this country, it's far more than what we're losing in trade. And it's a shame because we just have a lot of rhetoric all the time rather than just looking at the simple truth. And it seems to be a lot of dogma, I think, that prevents people from even looking at things, or they just don't want to. I'm not sure. But politicians are, I mean, I've worked with a lot, and it's very frustrating because you can tell them, listen, you know, the train's coming down the street and it's going to, if you don't step out of the way, you know, you're going to get killed. They go, well, you know, I don't say anything right now. And they just won't act until there is a crisis. To them, it's kind of like, you know, a guy comes up to you and says, listen, I just saved your life. And you look at him and you say, yeah, what would you do? Well, you see that car at the top of the hill? Somebody didn't put the brake on. It started rolling down. It would have hit you. So I jumped in the car, put the brake on, so I saved your life. The guy doesn't see it, so he goes, yeah, how do I know you're not just lying? And that's the way the politicians look at it, that they can't win an election by saying, vote for me because I stopped you from losing your house. And they would much rather that you're under the gun, that you're losing your house, and then say, vote for me and I'll prevent it. But they won't act in advance. So, unfortunately, that's, I think, what's wrong with our political system. And the two words, political economy, should have been divorced the first moment they met. But unfortunately, that's what we have to live with. And so they will not act until the crisis happens. And then they want to have their big hearings, and then they want to investigate, and then they always want to criminally charge somebody. But they've had investigations for every stock market crash since 1907. They've never found this mythical short player that pushed everything down. But it's great grandstanding, you know, and I mean, all the yelling and screaming that they did over the derivatives, but they still didn't regulate them. They still didn't stop the CDSs from being issued. They did nothing. They regulated other things and added more agencies and more government jobs, but they actually did not do anything to prevent what was happening. And to tell you the truth, the reason they will not do so is because the banks that they were looking at are the ones that are what is called primary dealers. Primary dealer is the one that sells the government debt for them. So they're never going to charge criminally any of those banks because they've become kind of like the financial crack dealer. They're not going to give them up. If they really wanted to help the economy, they should have shaved 25% off of the mortgages and basically funded it that way. That would have prevented all these massive foreclosures. And the problem with the foreclosure is, you know, some people say, oh, that's liberal, you're taking, but the problem is that all that property now comes out onto the market. By that coming onto the market, even if you have a house and you're current on your mortgage payments, now your property has declined in value because of everything else that's being sold. It's all interconnected. And so the worst recession ever is always a real estate recession. Because people will spend money as long as they feel they have equity in their home. If they feel that they no longer have that equity in their home for retirement or whatever, they don't spend money. So a real estate recession is the worst of all. And that's what we have.
I want to move on to the topic of gold. We've been talking about how the global markets work. We've got capital flows coming into the United States that's driving the dollar up, and we probably have the best-looking house in a bad neighborhood. Let's talk about gold for a minute, because there's some out there that propose a silly notion that if we had a gold standard, we wouldn't have these problems, even though when we had a gold standard, governments continued to print money. The 1920s in the U.S. is a good example of that. How does gold fit in here?
Well, gold is a good historical hedge, not against inflation. That's nonsense as well. It's really a hedge against political instability. And that's what we're really into at this stage in the game. It's a sovereign debt crisis that's developing on a global scale. Gold in 1980 was $875. And even if you look at foreign cars, a Porsche was about $50,000 back then. It's now about 110 or so. So with gold being at 16 to 1900 in that area, it's not overly priced. It's about on par with everything else that has risen. I mean, a Cadillac in 1995 was top of the line was about 45,000, and now they're also about 100,000 or so. So we're not looking at something that is abnormally overpriced compared to everything else. Gold will eventually run up dramatically as the crisis in the global sovereignty debt issue more or less percolates up all the way around the world. And then you have the possibility of gold going up to like $5,000 or something like that. But the main difference with gold is that gold standards are not, I think they're just sales pitches for people that are trying to sell gold. Gold is not a hedge against inflation, and it's not, a gold standard's not going to do anything. We've been there and done that, really. I mean, we had a gold standard, and politicians would not raise the price to $35 because they would have to admit that they printed more than they were supposed to. So they kept it at $35 until 1971, and Nixon could no longer hold it. We would have lost all the gold to Europe. So he closed the gold window. It was the only thing he really could do at the time. So the idea of creating any kind of a standard, doesn't matter what it's with, it does not really, has never historically worked. And that maneuver has been tried even going back to times of Babylon. There are tables there that they had produced which have survived, listing all the commodities and what are the prices to be regulated to be sold at. So, I mean, this idea has been around a long time, but nothing is going to force the politicians to suddenly be magnanimous or find religion. They're always going to spend more. They're always going to say, vote for me, and I'll give you this, that, and the other thing, and I'll let somebody else pay for it later on. And that's the kind of a system we have. So gold is more of a independent vote, so to speak. That the main advantage of gold is that it's at least movable. Those fleeing Germany and Russia have found that out. You can have a very nice house, but you can't take it with you. So gold has always historically been more of a store of wealth. It's not money. And that has always been some of these, people that keep trying to sell it for some reason or other, make up these stories that are just not true. It is a store of value. It will rise in value against government uncertainty. And that's really what we're looking at.
Final question, if I may, Martin. As you look forward over the next 12 months, what do your models tell you about the economy and the markets?
Well, basically, I think we're headed into going into the end of 2015 is where we're going to get another big, I think, economic crisis. I think that's probably where the sovereign debt crisis comes to a head. But between now and then, unfortunately, it just looks like more and more we're in a bull market for volatility. I think that initially we can still see gold consolidate a little bit. I wouldn't expect it to take off dramatically yet. Largely because a lot of people are still confused, trying to figure out what's going to happen in Europe. There are people that, want to be optimistic about it, but the old story of the difference between optimist and pessimist is that the two of them are on the top of the Sears Tower and they get blown over. And the pessimist immediately starts praying, oh my God, I'm going to die. And the optimist, as he's passing the fourth floor, says, well, so far so good. So I think that is pretty much sums up our problem. There are people that just don't want to admit that there are economic problems, and unfortunately, refusing to address them early on is kind of like cancer. I mean, you can cure it if you deal with it. But if you don't deal with it and you wait to the very last end, it's too late. So I think we're in a bull market of volatility, and that's what we're looking at, particularly over the next 2 years.
All right. Well, listen, Martin, as we close, you're having a World Economic Conference in Philadelphia. Tell our listeners about it. It's going to be held December 3rd and 4th.
Yes, we're doing the first day is really more for people that are more professional traders. That's kind of an analytical training session, more or less. The second day is our World Economic Conference, which I always enjoy because we have people flying in from absolutely everywhere in the world. They're coming from India, Southeast Asia, Japan, Australia, South Africa, all of Europe. I mean, we have participants coming from everywhere. And the main thing that I think a good international audience does, it allows you to see the global economy right there in the room. You can see the capital flows as opposed to just these myopic domestic type things. And that's why I enjoy them. That's why we call them our World Economic Conference, because basically everybody comes from all over the world. And we cover the whole world, not just the United States. And basically show the interconnectivity of what's going to happen over the next few years and why.
And if our listeners would like to find out more about that conference and make reservations, can they just go to your website, Martin?
Yes, they can go to armstrongeconomics.com, or they can go to martinarmstrong.org. And they'll find, details about the conference there that they can look at.